Is it live for everyone?
Yeah.
Hey, welcome back to Worldhoppers, the collaborative YouTube channel where we talk about stuff and things largely fantasy related, and all of the AdSense revenue goes to charity. So watch us all the time. It's a good thing. I think you've seen all the faces here before, so we're not going to introduce ourselves because you should know who we are. And today we're going to talk about sci-fi versus fantasy, or sci-fi and fantasy, and how they're different and how they overlap. How same. This is how I pitched it to my friends here, and I said we could talk about how different. So that's on the agenda today.
Woohoo! Hey. Yeah, so the first one, how are they similar? How same? I've always
like
said,
my phrasing.
I've always said, I don't know what it is. If you took basically the same plot that you would find in a fantasy book and you made it sci-fi, I instantly am not as interested, which is stupid. And it's something dumb in my brain. Not anything at fault with sci-fi, but I feel like how they're similar or how they're different taps into this. But as far as how they're similar, I mean, I think you see some similar character arcs a lot of times and character types, and they both require you to suspend an immense amount of disbelief, I think.
Well, it depends on how it's written too. I mean, there is some sci-fi, like, I haven't actually read The Martian. I think you have, Jesse, right? Where like he crowdsourced a lot of like science knowledge. So it's like if on the spectrum of how much disbelief you have to suspend, that's on the low end because it's as scientifically possible as fiction can be, versus Star Wars, where you have space wizards with laser swords. You're like, okay.
So I have something to say about that. I feel sort of the opposite, where when you have something, not to say that Star Wars is like exceptionally scientifically accurate or anything like that, but even though I think there is a lot of scientific facts or things that are as close to as possible with something like The Martian, I also feel like I almost have to suspend disbelief more, because in fantasy, you know how sometimes magic is too convenient, like it shows up every single time there's a problem to solve a problem. And that's how I felt when I picked up The Martian, is it felt like every single thing that came up, there was this kind of sort of scientific thing that would solve the problem. And so I never feared for the character. I never was like, oh no, this poor man's stranded out here, because it just was always something. And so that strangely made me have to suspend disbelief even more. Like I have to act with science that's almost accurate, almost.
I thought you were going to say something. I thought you were going to say something different, that like if you're trying to make it realistic, now it's a higher bar, and now I am paying attention, and now you do have to work harder to it, because otherwise, like if something like Star Wars, I'm like, well, I'm not expecting this to make sense. So at no point, like I just like in
laser swords.
Like at the jump, I already suspend disbelief, and I'm like, whatever. Versus something like The Martian, where I'm going to be like, well, I don't know if that particular thing seems possible. The rest, okay, but like it's a higher bar to clear all of a sudden. Versus Star Wars could have done something even more stupid than whatever this thing is that I'm doubting, and I'd be like, whatever, Star Wars.
Yeah, I think that's kind of true. I remember, I don't want to go into spoilers for the movie Interstellar for anybody that
no one cares. It's been long enough.
I remember watching that movie being wowed, thinking, oh my gosh, this is the best thing I've ever seen. This is amazing. And then there was a part that just got too far. It's
towards the end.
Toward the end, where I was like, no, I don't. This
fantasy
went too far.
Went too far. Whereas if it's just, I say this all the time about sci-fi, because my brain is something doesn't click. If you just call it magic, which is what I think you're touching on, if you just call it magic, I'll go with it. I'll be like, well, it's magic. Like that's how things work in this world. But when you're taking something from our own world, I guess you're right. It does sort of raise the bar of what needs to be accurate almost, because
you just have to work harder to convince me that this is possible.
Yeah,
something else where I'm like, sure.
Yeah.
And I found that there are books that I consider more sci-fantasy. Like there's definitely like books that lean heavily, like we've talked about The Martian, like heavily on real life science. Mm-hmm. And then there's books that kind of fall in the middle, like Red Rising is a good example of like sci-fantasy, I think, where it's essentially a fantasy book set in space.
Oh,
so
it's
that's where you get a lot of the similarities is story structure, because sci-fi is so broad that you could have something
science fantasy, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, like you could have something like dystopian sci-fi, or like something like Hunger Games, where it follows sort of like a chosen one trope. It's you can basically follow a fantasy story, or Red Rising, or Sun Eater, Empire Silence, very much as a blend.
Yeah.
But then you could have something like Revelation Space, or something by Michael Crichton, like Andromeda Strain, or Sphere, where it's totally a different theme. So it's like they're similar in the sense of like if you're going for that kind of story that focuses on characters and the story and not so much the science, that's when it basically feels like a fantasy story. Like Dune feels very fantasy, like very, very fantasy. Like the Bene Gesserit are wizards, and like there's basically magic in Dune. And the same thing with Star Wars. But if you have something by like Octavia Butler, or something like Hyperion, or you go back further like Philip K. Dick, like those are just very like thinking sci-fi that is almost like no character whatsoever. Like the characters that exist in the story are just kind of there to like tell you a story, but like similarities really come in that blend when you have something that's trying to do fantasy in space. Like if you've read any of Red Rising, like I think we all have, it's very much.
We haven't all liked it, but we've all read it.
But it's very much like until further you get to like Dark Age, and it's really weird sci-fi, but still kind of fantasy. It's like very much a like sort of chosen one story at the beginning, and you follow Darrow, and it's you pick up your friends along the way, and you're going on like a quest. That's kind of when you get those similarities.
Trying to take down the big bad guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Epic storytelling. Like there's some big thing we're doing here more often than not always, obviously, but
like bookstores and libraries and whatever, they shelve all of this together. Fantasy and sci-fi is all just over there together. And we, the readers of it, tend to be very clear about like, no, there's fantasy and there is sci-fi, and there's occasionally some sci-fantasy. But like we'll like, I thought of this because like you specifically had different mid-year tags for fantasy and for sci-fi, and when we were filming the fantasy one, we were like, oh, but you can't pick a sci-fi book for this because that's going to be in the sci-fi one. And then we're like, well, does it count as fantasy though? It's kind of like fantasy. Does it or does it not? And then like, is there a difference?
That I find really interesting is that I've noticed at some of my bookstores, they are trying to separate science fiction and fantasy, and it's not working because they'll have some Abercrombie in one and some in the other, and it's still part of like the first law world. So I'll go to the bookstore and I'll be like, they have to have this, right? And I'll be looking in fantasy, and then I'll be like, I wonder if it's in the sci-fi, and I look and it is, or something like the Bone Ships, which Jesse and I started, and then we didn't keep going, but that was, I think, in the sci-fi randomly. And I mean, I think at this point they're just looking at alphabetical, because I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them aren't even remembering that they have it as separate, because they will have a formal A section, B, C, D, the alphabetical order for the author's last names in both. And so I think they're just going over to that section and putting the books where they typically would go, not realizing, oh, wait, we've changed this now. It's made it quite confusing, I must say.
Oh boy.
Yeah, geez.
I was just like, I would never think to shelve Abercrombie in sci-fi.
No, absolutely
I was thinking
not.
more like
Read
Jemison has a lot of books where you'd be like, is this science fiction? Is this fantasy? Is it both? Or you'd be like, this gets to be in the like Venn diagram center zone. We'll have a separate shelf for that.
So as far as how they're different, for me, I find typically as just a general thought, that if it has to do with space or advancements in technology, those seem to be the key factors. But then you get something like Foundry Side, which I think its magic system sort of ties into technological advances in a fantasy world. So then I could see if somebody wanted to categorize that as sci-fi. But it's almost like sci-fi has to have its roots in it once was our world, and then we've branched out. And fantasy, a lot of times, unless you're talking about dystopian or something, it seems to be more like this is a brand new world that has nothing to do with our planet.
Yeah,
and I almost feel like if we go to our future, it's dystopian until we leave the Earth, and then it's sci-fi.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. I find that the themes are always very different. Like when I think of science fiction, I think of exploring themes like what would this technological advancement actually look like in our society and how would we react to it? Or things like what Michael Crichton in Jurassic Park explores, like do we want to play God with some of these technological advancements?
It doesn't go well.
Does life always find a way? Like those sorts of things, the climate change, like all of these things, exploring those themes in science fiction is what I always think of. And then themes in fantasy can range so much, but it's typically not those things that you're exploring. It's much more character-driven themes and societal themes like, I don't know, economic.
What it means to be a human being. And
yes,
there's the line, because people are like AI versus human kind of overlap a lot of times. And I think something like Scythe, I'm always like, I guess it's kind of fantasy because it's dystopian kind of, but then also it's sci-fi. And
I think that's very sci-fi.
I've seen it as like sci-fi YA fantasy. Like it's like all of it.
It doesn't know.
It's speculative fiction.
Yeah, there you go.
I feel like Mara always uses the term speculative fiction, and I'm always like, when should I use this?
That's just like the broadest
when in doubt, speculative.
Speculative is like the broadest term for
I know, I just feel like I should call everything speculative.
Yeah, basically is. I feel like for me, like when you were talking like the difference with like the technology versus like magic, I think that because I struggle with sci-fi, especially hard sci-fi. We've got a lot of jargon and technological, scientific spaceship jargon. I focus on it too much because I feel like my brain says I should understand it because it's based on science. I'm like, I should get this right. Whereas with magic, I'm like, I don't need to understand. It's magic. It's fine. I don't have to like think about this too hard.
The type of writing style that goes with that type of hard science or hard sci-fi tends to be the kind of writing style where they're like just bullet points and here's just the information because this is like technology versus fantasy where we're like elaborately describing the magic system to you. And it's just as much nitty-gritty, pedantic, like detail.
I just
described in a way that's you're like, oh, tell me a story about the magic thing versus like facts that I must memorize for the test.
And I remember go ahead, Shauna. Sorry, no, go ahead.
I was gonna say I think I just focused like to me stuff that is like hard sci-fi probably isn't actually hard sci like freaking what is it? Not the long way to
Long Way to Small Angry Planet?
No, not that one. Something ship at the edge of the universe.
Oh yeah, the
Alex White
novel.
Yeah, that one. I started reading that, and like it's not even. It's very character driven. It's very character based and like fun times and like like their relationships. But then there's like scenes where they're like the spaceship and it's falling apart and this, and they're like describing all the parts, and I just get like too focused on it, and it pulls me out of it, and I lose it, and then I don't care anymore.
Sorry. I just want to say I pushed into pros and cons just because I feel like we're starting to touch on this, and because I know, Leanna, you've mentioned before that this can sometimes cause you to not be able to visualize, right?
I was about to say, like, when they're describing something like really high tech and advanced that we've never seen before, I'm like, I have no point of reference for that. Versus if you tell me about an army carrying magic swords, okay, it's magic swords, but I can picture an army carrying swords.
I was just gonna say, like, for sci-fi, just kind of the differences, and you can say whether it's pro or con. I feel like there's a big difference too between like classical sci-fi and modern day sci-fi, where like there's a shit ton of space operas now. So like Last Watch just came out. That's a space opera. Like I'm reading The Expanse. That's very much a space opera that they compare to Game of Thrones because why not? But it's like there's
everything is Game of Thrones.
It is. But there's like that's very heavily focused on the characters and the story. And yeah, there is science that's talked about, but it's not nearly as detailed. And it is kind of just like this is the way things are, and you almost read it like it's a fantasy book. And same with like Empire of Silence. There's a lot in there that there's some things that make sense, but you also just kind of go along with it because a lot of things basically are magic. And it's not going to be explained. But if you go and you read, like I mentioned, Revelation Space, or if you read Andromeda Strain, it's almost like the story kind of stops to just like dump information on you. Like, here is my thesis that I researched, and this is why this is scientifically accurate. So Joshana, don't read any Crichton except for maybe Jurassic Park because you'll probably hate it. And that was my biggest struggle when I read Andromeda Strain. I was like, I want the story, like the story and the plot was interesting, and what was happening I was interested in. But I felt like every chapter Crichton stopped to tell me how smart he was, and I was like, just keep going. Like,
don't be jelly.
Just
That's
get
why
there.
you're upset. You wish.
Well, I mean, he is very smart, but I was just like, just stop it. Just get me through to the end. And then by the time the story actually took place, I was like, I don't care.
I think Jesse hit on something like that is also part of the reason that I probably don't read as much sci-fi, because and when you're talking about like the themes and how that's what's kind of different about it, I do often, and then like Alex made me think of it now, that it is often the theme that is actually at the centerpiece of the story rather than the people or what's happening.
The characters usually exist to just facilitate that theme.
And I feel like it's very much in that way, then it's idea centric rather than story and character centric. So like I was like telling Alex that I read Forever War, which is the net or Amazon just did a movie of it. What do they call it?
The Tomorrow War. That's the Amazon one,
The book, The Forever War, like I think it was a good book, but I didn't enjoy reading it. And it was because it felt like it was all about the concept of like how this like the time difference thing. I don't know if you guys know what it's about, but it's like about how it's kind of like Interstellar, where like because of the way space stuff works, and I'm clearly an expert, like you would end up spending like hundreds of years at war because of the fact that like that, what is that called? It's in Interstellar, where they like, because their proximity to whatever and the speed of light, whatever, but that's why it's a forever war. And it seemed like the book was about that, not so much about this character's journey and them going to war and whatever. And I was like, that's interesting. But also, like, I don't care because you didn't make me care about the characters.
The part in Interstellar where that very thing, like, they get stuck, and when they come out, it's only been, a certain amount of time for them, but then all this time has passed on Earth. And that, to me, is what made that movie, like, those moments where you see the effects, the negative effects of things like that. And the like, if you've seen that movie, you know the scene I'm talking about when they realize how much time has passed.
Yeah.
And I find, and we're all doing it right now in this video, I feel like we keep adding this little asterisk of, well, I mean, like, the author is really smart, or talking about The Martian, like, well, a lot of it is. So something I think is kind of both a pro and a con is it's an opportunity for people to find fiction based in a lot of science and perhaps pique their curiosity about these different subjects, which is great. But we also do have a tendency to elevate the people writing sci-fi and then sometimes ourselves for reading sci-fi, because we're like, well, it's like smart people stuff. And where fantasy is like make-believe stuff. And I'm like, this is make-believe too. It really is. You know
well,
what
I mean? Like the stuff that you're talking about, though, like time travel or time moving at different rates, like that's all theories anyway. Because I mean, you basically could call it magic at this point because it's based in science, but it's not proven. So like, for example, in Empire of Silence, in that world, people go into fugue, which is just cryosleep. So you travel for, like, you don't age while you're in cryosleep, but dozens of years or hundreds of years could pass while you're asleep, and then you wake up and you're technically 150, but you're 10. So it's like that's, I mean, magic. It's not real, but
yeah, and like some of that is rooted in, because obviously if the Earth is continuing to move and then somebody comes away from it, like a lot of time is going to happen.
Time is still going, yeah.
So like it's based and rooted in something real, but then we expand on that, and then that's where my brain is always saying, well, then just it's magic. We'll just, and I actually, tying back to the beginning of this, if you just tell me this is how it is on this world or this planet or whatever, I'm like, okay. But then if you're, like you were saying, Alex, if you're going on and on and on about like the science of it and stuff, that's when I think I do the same thing Joshana does, where I'm like, well, but wouldn't technically, because that happened in Foundry Side, and again, I know that's considered fantasy, but there was a moment where the author is explaining the way this one weapon works and how you can have it shoot as if it's been falling for a certain amount of time, and therefore if it's been falling for that long, it's going to hit on impact as if it's been falling X amount of feet when really you shot it from like 2 feet away.
Magic.
I started thinking, and I was like, but don't things at a certain point, like, what's it, this is physics, and I'm
yes,
stupid.
I don't remember.
Like,
talking about
when something that really eventually makes things go, it's all going to be the same, right? And then I'm like, well, wait, wouldn't that at some point, because it'd be like, it's like it'd been shooting for thousands and thousands of feet, and I'm like, or whatever the amount is that would maximize that, and then so I start doing that, or I overthink it. So there's like this idea that, sorry, Luna's drinking water if you can hear, but there's this idea that it's like more intelligent or it's more intellectual, and because it's pondering things and the musings of mankind, that it's better. And
it's really more like highfalutin and highbrow.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm always like, can't we just accept it's all fiction? And
I don't envy sci-fi writers and the like pedantic questions that they would get. Like, for example, like at
Howlerfest.
I was gonna say, like, was it at Howlerfest? Because I've been to a couple sightings, but I remember there was a guy who was asking about like terraforming on one of the planets and
Yes,
like why it was whatever.
Vividly, because I remember Leanne and I went to Howlerfest together, and I remember turning to her and being like, all annoyed, because one person's like, how come on this one planet, if they can control the atmosphere, then how come it's snowy? And he's like, it'd be boring if everybody was frolicking in meadows. That's why. And like, he just didn't care. And
like, oh, it's fiction.
It's fiction. I wanted to
made it up.
Yeah, and but I also get, as a reader, if you're like, well, but why would they ever live in harsh conditions if they can kind of control it? And I can understand why that person, maybe it bothered them. I would never ask the author that.
But I mean, like, it's not dissimilar from what happens in fantasy. Like, well, if magic fixes everything, there's always some contrived reason why magic doesn't work here, which creates the problem. So sci-fi has to do the exact same thing and be like, but for whatever reason, the technology fails here because hence problems.
There's a glitch.
The Eagles could have just carried Frodo and the ring to Mordor, and the book and the movie ends.
Exactly.
Not that I'm like trying to go into politics or anything, but who was it that shared? Was it you, Leanna, that talked about like the vaccine? You would think that's what was that thing you shared?
It was like that the Eagles are the perfect metaphor for the vaccine, because you think that that's the end, but actually there's a lot of faffing around before the credits.
Not actually.
Well, what do you think are like pros though? I feel kind of bad. I feel like we've been kind of negative on it, but
it's just you.
When I find like,
why do you hate sci-fi?
I don't read sci-fi a lot, but like, and like it's I feel like it's weird that some of the only sci-fi I own and have read is Ursula K. Le Guin, which I feel like is just real like introspective, and it's not really about like the science necessarily. It's all like on other planets. I've only read from the Hainish cycle, not some other series.
Is that the Left Hand of Darkness and those books?
Yeah, I've read the Left Hand of Darkness a couple times, and like the word for world is forest, and they're so like thought provoking. And it's more like you were saying, Jesse, it's about like the theme and like the concept of like how humanity behaves in these other circumstances, and how different creatures behave with humanity and their cultures, and like what these alien cultures look like and how that interacts with humanity and how humanity interacts with them, with like the complete like foreign race or whatever creatures. And I don't know, I just find it like really interesting, but I can't read, like, I don't think I could read like 2 Ursula K. Le Guin books back to back. I'd be like, all right, give me a break. That was a lot.
Yeah.
I guess it's still kind of more sci-fi because it's technological centering but something like virtual reality type stories I do think are interesting because they explore some of those themes, but also based off of how much people now are so sucked into social media, it allows for commentary about how we can lose ourselves in something artificial, which I do find really interesting. So I think some of the themes that come up in sci-fi, I actually find to be some of my favorite themes, but I know Leanna, you were saying that sometimes the whole thing, or Alex, you're saying like the characters facilitate the themes, it seems. And that's where I get a little bummed out, but I love so many of the themes because I do like sitting and wondering and questioning with characters and pondering things. And I think that's really fun. It's just sometimes the extra stuff can...
I mean, it depends on what book you're reading. So like, I know Jesse's read Dark Matter. Has anybody else read Dark Matter?
Oh, Jade needs to be here.
So I mean, it's a sci-fi thriller. Jason Dessen is just there to move the story along. He's not like a super interesting protagonist or anything like that. And like his family is there and the characters just kind of exist to basically get you through the story of this whole concept of like having a multiverse. Like that's like the center topic of the book and how that could function. Everybody else is just kind of there to like be in the scene. It's not like you leave that book like, oh man, Jason was such a good character and like I want to read more about him. It's like, no, it was, you care about like the science and what was going on and the possibilities of like
Tenet, where like the main character in Tenet is literally like the protagonist. He doesn't have a name. He's just the protagonist.
Pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
As far as that example of dark matter, that's an aspect of thrillers also, is it's more about the feeling for the reader. So that one's kind of a combination. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that too, like the taking the reader for a ride kind of feel. Without necessarily like, sci-fi doesn't always have these really intense things, right? Sometimes it's about like, look how cool these things are, or look how interesting this world is. And that can be really fun too, I think. But in those instances, like I haven't read Leviathan Wakes, and you guys know Sean hated it.
It's good. Sean's
get him that beautiful bright pink anniversary.
Listen.
Cool. I showed him.
Sean and Alan highly exaggerate the amount of gravity talk. Okay.
I actually think they do. There was not
very
that
exaggerated.
I don't know what Alan's doing, because Sean is being a troll right off the bat, and then Alan, it's like grapevine trolling.
So what Leviathan Wakes does is they explain like how many G's would affect like the air and stuff around you, but it's like a sentence.
Oh,
so
I know.
Like, well, we need to get to 5G to do this, and then that's it. It's not like they break down like there's not a chapter of like gravity discussion.
I know. Sean's just a troll all the time. He hated it though, and I've heard him make fun of it so much that I'm never going to be able to read it and not laugh my way through it.
If you don't like Holden or Miller, you're going to hate the book.
Oh,
because there's only two POVs.
I'm sure I remember their names better than characters from books I've read, because Sean has made fun of them so much. Like I know one of them's like a grizzled captain detective who just has epiphanies about the plot and what's happening, and Sean's like, "This is stupid." He goes crazy about it. But anyway, Leanna, he didn't like that special edition. He thought it was quite cool. He's like, he's like, too bad I don't like the book. It kind of reminds me of the covers of Saga, which I haven't read, but Sean's read. They're comic books. Anyway.
Actually, you made me think of like a whole part of sci-fi that we've kind of just been kind of assuming sci-fi means spaceships, which a lot of it does, but there's like when you mentioned like virtual reality and also AI and a lot of stuff that, I mean, there's a lot of more near future sci-fi that deals with no spaceships, nothing like that. And it's not dystopian, where it's just like, we've invented, AI and, like the movie AI.
I mean, that's what I was going to say. I think that sci-fi, all the things that we were talking about, kind of cons, for me, that's a lot of the pros, is the focus on themes like we talked about. And then also the technological advancements. That's my favorite little niche part of sci-fi, is focusing on stories that are those near future stories, like Dark Matter and like the Punch Escrow and like Jurassic Park, even, where it's like literally it's possible in a way, but you're just exploring like, how would society react to this, and like thinking like, oh my god, like putting our society in in those shoes, like what would we do? It's so fascinating to me. And I think that for me, I don't visualize a lot of things when I read, so I can kind of just go with the flow and I don't have to like really overthink it. I'm just like, okay, take me for the ride. Whatever. I believe what you say. So I don't really like second guess things, but that's like my favorite little niche part of sci-fi. And I also really like Chaos Walking, I think, is a really good example of like sci fantasy that I think leans a little more on science fiction in the later books, where it talks a lot about like occupying a planet that we don't belong to and the repercussions of that. And I just think that those sorts of conversations and themes are so interesting. So I love sci-fi for the themes. And there's definitely different kinds of sci-fi, and spaceships are not necessarily my favorite part of it.
I do want to add, I do like near future, and that's why I brought up Scythe, even though it is
Scythe is a good one,
yeah. And I mean, even something like, there's a part of Scythe, because even though the concept of Scythe is like, we've essentially conquered death, except for now there's the threat of overpopulation. And supposedly, you know, like we haven't figured out how to go elsewhere to other planets or those kinds of things. So therefore we're stuck here. So what do we do?
That doesn't make sense.
Well,
you can solve death, but you don't have space travel?
You got to read the book.
I don't think I need to read the book.
But,
sounds pretty dumb.
You got to read it.
Read the book.
Trolling.
I feel like those must be better.
I hear they talk about gravity a lot.
Anyway, so there's an aspect though about the story that talks about like being able to almost communicate with the dead because artificial intelligence has sort of created them in a sense based off of the way they lived and like how basically what I'm saying is that Sean recently read an article about the idea of like living forever through your social media in a sense. And this, like, he read this article and I was like, that's weirdly similar to a thing that popped up in Scythe where they can communicate with people who have died because it's so similar to how that person actually was and things like that. And I'm like, that's kind of weird. You know, like that moment where you're like, oh, creepy. It's like, actually, you know, those kinds of...
The thing I love about sci-fi is the kind of sci-fi that kind of gives you chills because you're like, oh, wow, no, I hadn't thought of that. Oh, yeah. And I mostly watch sci-fi because of like that visualization barrier where like I can't either understand the tech talk or I can't picture what you're talking about. And so I don't pick it up because most of the time when I have picked it up, I'm like, what? But if I'm watching it, like I can see what's going on. And if there's a bunch of tech jargon, I'm like, well, you'll show me how it looks when you're done explaining it. So it's fine. So like I watch it a lot and I love things like, what's that one that was on Netflix where Black Mirror? Well, Black Mirror as well. But I meant the longer, what's it called? The one where like they sleeve you in different bodies because you exist on a chip.
Altered Carbon?
Altered Carbon. So stuff like that, where like I love the idea of like what that would do to you and your sense of self. And like sci-fi asks a lot of those questions, like, you know, who are you if you are not a human, or who are you if you are not on Earth, or like blah 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 blah.
That's a really big theme in all of sci-fi is like what actually makes you you, and does it have anything to do with your body, or is it your conscience? And I guess that's on a lot.
Just made me
Memory
think
Called Empire.
I'm gonna read it.
It's so good.
Just sent it to me.
What are you saying to Shauna? It makes you think of what?
I just say that just because I was watching all kinds of theory videos today. What Alex just said makes me think of the MCU and Vision from WandaVision. And like technically isn't superhero stuff sci-fi? Technically? I mean, it's like speculative fiction and it could be fantasy, but there's like a lot of tech stuff. I feel like that counts.
And other planet stuff.
Superheroes.
I think some superheroes are more like sci-fi, like Iron Man, and some are more fantasy, like Thor. So it's kind of like, and they all come together to just be superheroes.
A literal fantasy creature.
Yeah. Mythological. That'd be my preference. Yeah, I like it when it's not like, I don't mind sci-fi that gets like heady and like very introspective or whatever. But yeah, if they get a lot of tech jargon happening, whether it's based in reality or not, if it's totally made up or not, it's not even that I try to like figure it out. I just go, I don't know. What is
We're almost about to start cursing.
Listen, I caught myself. I caught myself. Very good at catching myself. But yeah, like I just it's like I clock out. My brain just clocks out. So I prefer it if it's like, I don't mind if we're in space. I just don't want to hear a bunch about the spaceship. Well,
and I'll add to be fair, as I know a lot of us are big fantasy readers too. I remember when I was reading Black Prism, and there's this whole part, I could be exaggerating, okay, but I swear it was like at least one whole, if not two whole pages explaining how the magic made this elevator work. And I'm like, I don't care about this stupid elevator. I don't care.
Was it going to keep you up at night wondering how the elevator
works? And I mean, there are times where I feel like that kind of stuff, I would love it. I wish there was somebody here who could love that, the tech jargon in science fiction, to say why they love it so much. Because for me, I'm like,
well, I think for like people who know something about that, well, then they also get annoyed because they know enough about it to know that this is false. But I mean, I feel like that kind of person who is into like taking apart a computer and building it themselves is the kind of person that's going to be like, tell me your texture.
It depends on the book, though. So, I mean, as far as building computers, I've been doing that since I was like 12. But like,
tell us why.
Because it was fun. It's fun to take things apart and put them together yourself.
That's my dad and my brother all the time.
It depends on the book and the delivery, though, because there's certain authors that can make it really interesting and others make it very boring. And unless, I mean, obviously there's books for everybody. So some people are going to like this super dry, just paragraphs of endless detail, but others are not. And it really depends on the book and how it's delivered in the story. And if you're invested enough to care, honestly. So like when I was reading Revelation Space, I wasn't that interested in it. So when it was getting bogged down, especially like the middle part of that book of a lot of like the detail and the story wasn't really going anywhere, I was like, okay, like this is, some of it's really, really cool, like explaining how they have ships that are like hundreds of kilometers long. That is baffling. And then there's other things that I'm just like, who cares? Like, just move along. So it really depends on the delivery of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think of Jurassic Park a lot because Jurassic Park is an example where Michael Crichton definitely does go into a lot of detail on how it would be possible.
I think it's kind of just his writing style.
Yeah, but I love dinosaurs so much that I was like here for it the whole time. I was like, how can we do this? Because I want dinosaurs.
And then at the end, did you still want dinosaurs?
No, it'd be horrible.
No, that would be terrible.
Jurassic World Dominion is coming and it's going to show us what would happen if dinosaurs were in our world. It's going to be messy. So yeah, like if I'm like really into like that subject, I'm like, tell me more. And the same thing, I think of Rhythm of War.
Fantasy can be guilty of this as well.
Yes, I was just going to say, like, the fantasy magic systems can sometimes lean very heavily into that as well. And I think of Rhythm of War from the Stormlight Archive as a good example. It goes into such detail of the science behind the magic system. But for me, I was like, this is fascinating. Tell me more, Sanderson, about Stormlight, because I am so invested in that magic system and so invested in that world that I cared. But there are other magic systems that I'm like, oh my God, just move along because I don't care enough. So I think it just depends on, like you said, the book and how invested you feel in that idea or that concept.
Yeah, your personal interest in it. Because I say, like, I tend to get irritated when I read Sanderson books when it gets very like, let me explain to you all of the rules, and I'm like, well, whatever. This is real. But but like, I love The Wolf. I don't know if you know that. But like when I made Bethany read it, she was like, it was interesting. It did kind of spend a lot of time here and there kind of describing how things work a lot. And I was just like, yeah, but it's so cool. It's so interesting. And she was like, it wasn't not interesting. And I was like, it's amazing.
I did not think it was interesting.
I was telling Deshauna about a book called For the Wolf, and she was like, because she thought I said The Wolf, and she's like, that is not what that book is about.
She was describing like this romance part of it, and I was like, no, what did she say? I had to like go back. I'm like, that's not The Wolf at all.
But like, even back to Sanderson real quick. So I'm one of the people that hated that entire section of Rhythm of War. Anytime that was dwelled upon, I checked out mentally. But I love allomancy. So in all of Era 1 Mistborn, when he's describing how that works, I was all for it. But Rhythm of War, like I kind of took Stormlight as like a soft magic system. So when they're breaking it down and trying to have a science class, I did not care whatsoever.
That was me in Mistborn. Every time we're like, they threw the coins to this angle, and it.
Hey Elle, can you go ahead and mute Deshauna real quick?
Yeah, I got so irritated. I was like, I freaking don't care about all the like. It went over here, and then he bounced off at this angle.
I have to say, though, I mean, I predominantly read fantasy, and then I do watch a lot of sci-fi. But I feel like the things that really stick with me and like affect me, and I continue to think about most of the time, are sci-fi and not fantasy. Fantasy will be, it'll touch my heart, and it'll be memorable, and I'll love it, and I'll recommend it, and I'll reread it and love it. But the stuff that like affects me, that completely changes how I think of something, that will give me chills for days, is sci-fi. So
sometimes it feels like sci-fi is, I'm going to make you think after, and then fantasy is like, I already thought of all of it, like the whole world and how everything works, and now you get to just enjoy it. You don't have to ponder it. Here you go.
You like these characters and care about them.
Yeah, Luna. Sorry, Luna. I'm afraid is gonna knock something over because she's like sniffing the cords and stuff. Hello. Do you want to say hello? Hello.
She's like, nope, I'm out. It's like my cats. Whenever they come and bug me when I'm filming, and then I pick them up, and then they're like, like all right, bye. Over here.
I think also with because you all are kind of hitting at the, it depends on how much you're interested in it. I also think it depends on how much you can visualize it for some people. Like Allomancy is a very visual magic system because they're like flying through, not all of it, right? There's aspects that are like affecting your emotions, but it's kind of simple, a concept that's simple. Like I ingest this and then I have this power, and you're like, okay. And they fly around and they throw stuff at each other and stuff like that. And so it kind of ties back into the action scenes, whereas some magic doesn't. And then also I've seen before the idea that soft magic systems are more rooted in like folklore and things like that. And for some people that just acceptance is easy, and then other people hate it because they're like, I need the explanation. And I think that that's true for sci-fi as well, as some people want that explanation even if it's not actually possible. Whereas the rest of us, not the rest, but like some of us are also thinking, well, but that's almost real. But then there's this part that doesn't make sense though, because it's rooted in something kind of real.
Well, then you also have sci-fi that doesn't explain anything because the characters in it wouldn't think to be explaining this to you because they live with this, or they no longer understand how this works or whatever. So there's like other flavors of sci-fi where it plays with that as well, where it's not going to tell you anything. And like you either have to be okay with that.
Go with the flow.
But like for like Red Rising, like I know Alan adores the space battles and all of the like war stuff that's in Red Rising. And I think for as far as I can tell, it's well written, but I have a lot of trouble picturing what's going on in the space battles in Red Rising. So I'm just like, just tell me who died. I don't know what's happening.
The very beginning of Red Rising, because I liked the original trilogy, but when it first starts, I'm like, I don't know what any of this is. Like when it's describing like
That's because Pierce Brown just throws compound words around like it's nobody's business and doesn't explain any of it.
Speaking of Alan things, I remember when he started and he's like, why? Why does he keep capitalizing the
right? Like sling blades.
I remember there's like, I think it's in Morningstar where like they use claw drills but in a space battle, and I already barely could picture what a claw drill looked like when this whole thing started, and now I'm supposed to know how it works and how it works. I just pictured
somebody like in like a giant drill just like drilling into it and then hopping out. Like it's a little like pod.
Something else is that I'm very picky with action scenes in both science fiction and fantasy, because at some point I'm like, if I can't visualize what's going on, that's why I think I don't like Golden Sun as much as a lot of other people, because I'm like, I don't know what's happening, you know? I think that can be described for Jessie.
Jessie just left us with the dinosaurs.
There's your dinosaurs.
She just left us with the little boppy pillow and walked away.
So it is relevant.
She was talking about Jurassic Park, so there you go. We've come full circle.
Well, that's why I DNF'd Golden Sun, is because like there's all these freaking space battles. I was like, I don't care. I don't know what's going on. Like, I can't.
No, that's what I always feel like I'm in the minority, because I don't like the second one. Everybody's like, oh, the second one's infinitely better than the first. And I'm like, I like book one, and then book 3, and book 2 I kind of had to get through to bridge the gap. That's how I feel. Although there were some fun twists and stuff in book 2.
That's
I don't know if fun is the word.
There are a lot of twists. Lots and lots of twists in Red Rising.
So the last one, which we kind of touched on some of this, is just impressions and misconceptions. And I feel like people watching this who love sci-fi are probably like, you guys are the ones getting these misconceptions. But I think like anything, if you aren't super familiar with it, you're going to have these ideas of what it is from your limited experience. And I find for myself, I tend to like YA sci-fi more because it's easier and they're not worried about
more accessible.
What was that?
Like it's more accessible.
Yeah. That's
you're not like familiar with all of this type of stuff already, you know.
And I think it concentrates more on characters too in YA. In general, very general statement there. But
I mean, I would say a misconception or impression of sci-fi in general is just like you guys said at the very beginning, is that it's in space.
Yeah,
it's not always in space.
Yeah,
This doesn't take place in space. This isn't sci-fi.
doesn't count.
Where's the spaceships?
There's no aliens, so
Yeah. I think like I don't know. I mean, obviously there are people who have misconceptions about any kind of speculative fiction and think it's silly and like for the plebeians or whatever because they're busy reading.
I feel like less of that than fantasy.
Yeah, I think so for sure. For sure. Yeah, I think fantasy gets way more of that. Like, oh, you want to read about wizards? Yeah, I do.
You know what's interesting is my husband is not a huge like fantasy or sci-fi reader, but he is more likely to pick up a sci-fi book over a fantasy book because he feels like it's more accessible because you aren't getting oriented all the time to a totally new world, totally new places, naming conventions, magic systems. So sci-fi in that way, I know we've talked about it being inaccessible for a lot of us due to like the jargon or, some of the themes or whatever it may be. But for a lot of people, it's more accessible for that reason where they look at a fantasy book and they're like, oh my God, like that's
everything's new.
Everything's new. Yeah.
That does make sense, though,
we kind of have talked about how some sci-fi can be like really bogged down in like tech detail or explaining how this works or the science behind it or the theory behind it or whatever. And fantasy can also be that way. And I feel like there's almost like a spectrum where like pedantic fantasy is on one end of it and pedantic sci-fi is on the other end of it. And then like we like in the middle we meet with like characters and philosophy and is it science or is it magic? And then we like shift to the other end.
Pretty much.
Yeah, I was gonna say that makes sense though because, I mean, obviously, like I read mostly fantasy and I read a lot more fantasy than sci-fi, like a lot. But like there are I think I'm just used to it with fantasy. What you're talking about with naming conventions. I just read a book that I really enjoyed. I gave it 4.25 or 4.5 stars. But towards the beginning, with like the different names of like the kingdom and it's an empire and what's the name of the empire and is that the city name or is that the kingdom name and then like okay are they the ruler are they a regent what's their name for regent though and they have like 3 different titles for one person and I'm like who the is this what
she's talking about Rage of Dragons.
I was not talking about Rage
I actually was thinking that as she said
you know I didn't give that
that's because so many people complain about Rage of Dragons specifically. Which I'm the same way with fantasy though. I'm just like, yeah, this is just what it's called. Like it's a fantasy book. I'm just gonna go with it. But Rage of Dragons specifically, so many people complain about just like names and stuff being thrown around and no explanation as to what they are. And I was just like, I
wasn't even paying attention.
I was
to
like,
that.
whatever, it's fine.
I have to add to
I was too distracted with my hate.
We know,
I think that is all very true, and I think we're so used to it as fantasy readers. The closest thing I can relate to what Jesse's husband has described is reading the book Dark of the West, which is basically historical fiction. It just takes place in a different world. It's not our world, but it's World War I, World War II inspired, right? That's basically what it is. But when you don't know the history behind all these different countries, it almost makes it feel like the story is not as fleshed out because when we read historical fiction, we're like, I already kind of know what happened with like these were the you already kind of have an idea and so the book doesn't have
you don't have to explain why Hitler's the baddie. No, I know I'm on the same page.
Try not to say Hitler. But that's like kind of and it's so weird because I rarely experience that because usually when I go into a fantasy book it's all new, it's all different, and this was it was such a niche little book, which I quite enjoyed it, but it's so different from most fantasy I've read because how many fantasy books follow a fighter pilot in a basically World War I, World War II inspired story? So I can absolutely see why that would be less accessible. Now on the Rage of Dragons thing, I have 2 thoughts for that. First, I do think it's slightly unfair because there's all sorts of books that have all sorts of words. And that one specifically, I think also people are so used to more European stuff.
Yeah, I mean, for sure.
So that's why I think And I'm saying this as like in defense of
racism.
I would defend that also, even though I can't read the dragons.
But
I didn't even notice that.
I will say there is a part, I remember it super distinctly because we randomly one time go to one other person's POV for no reason, and we see the scene through their eyes, and then they're thinking about Tao, and on one page they had to have called him at least 3 or 4 different things. Like he's whatever his class is, whatever like kind of like they called him so, and I'm like, wait. And then they would refer to themselves as what they are, and like they're like slur for Tao's people. And
I have this exact same problem with Red Rising though, because everyone has 10 names and 10 nicknames, and I'm like, I've got Darrow, Severo, and Mustang, and then everybody else.
All I need to know.
But I also think like when you're kind of almost like a veteran of a certain genre, you know how to take it in better and like what to pay attention to, because there are some fantasy books where they'll start, like I think The Wolf of Orinyaru is a good example. They'll start naming off all these other things, and it's only first person, so you don't get any other perspective. So if they're talking about it in that moment, that's your only opportunity to understand whatever they're talking about. And sometimes I'm like, I don't know. But I'm like, doesn't really affect things that much. And I actually think people who like diving into it are going to like the book even more, because they probably will be able to pick up on all of that. But I'm not one of those people constantly flipping back to the map and being like, okay, that country's here, so they're talking about geographically.
So that's I think part of the reason why like Brandon Sanderson appeals to me less versus Joe Abercrombie, because like Joe Abercrombie is just telling a story about characters, and like you kind of need to know some geography. You kind of need to know that once upon a time there might have been a little bit of magic somewhere, but it's really not about that.
It's also really simple to follow their trail. Like they, at least in the first trilogy, like they don't move that much.
But even then, like you don't really even need to pay attention to where they're moving, because like
it's kind of irrelevant.
It's not the point. Versus like something like a Sanderson book where there's like all these rules and they interconnect, and there's a greater universe, and is this a clue, and does it connect to this, and you end up like that like what's his name from It's Always Sunny with his board of yarn.
Yeah. Charlie.
Conspiracy theory. And we're like, you can't, I mean, I guess you could film like a theories video for First Law, but it's more just going to be like, is that character going to betray somebody? Answer is yes.
Exactly.
Theory's over.
That's, I feel like, the big one. Like, there'll be things I'll bring up like, how come this is like this? And they'll be like, theories are that this person's also actually an eater, and therefore, and I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's why everybody is really resilient in that story. I don't know.
Maybe
like,
there's a 17th shard
that like wants to get into like, I never look at maps, appendices, like glossaries. I ignore that. Those are just extra pages that I had to pay for that I don't need. Versus, so like I feel like the kind of sci-fi that does a lot of that is not going to be something that I'm just going to be like, I don't know what any of this is, and I don't care about what any of this is. So the kind of sci-fi that leans more towards being a character-driven philosophical examination of what this would do to people if they did this, or what it would mean for people to encounter this. Same thing with fantasy. That's what I want out of both of them, and I just find it a lot more in fantasy than in sci-fi. In as far as I've encountered, and I have probably looked for the right sci-fi to find that, but like fantasy, I know where to look to get that.
I feel like all of us need to go back. Maybe not Alex, because you're more well-versed in sci-fi, but I feel like the rest of us need to go watch our own Worldhoppers video that I think Jade ran, where they give sci-fi recommendations. Like, all of us need to go watch that.
Just the thing about like fantasy, for the very generalized opinion of like, you kind of know what to expect going into a fantasy story in general. Like, there is a good amount of tropes that like you kind of expect to see. You can,
how dare you?
Generally glean what you're going to get out of it. And everybody's read so many of like the popular fantasy stories that everyone kind of talks about it and can tell you what it's about. Sci-fi is more of like a mystery box, depending like, unless you read a ton of sci-fi, like it could be anything from, you know, Parable of the Sower to a space opera, like or like 1984, Fahrenheit 451, like all these things that are basically, you know, a version of a dystopian sci-fi, but it's more of the theme of like what would happen in a society that allows this thing to, you know, sort of take over. Or Handmaid's Tale, like that's definitely science fiction. It's our future, but I mean, if you watch it or read it, it's not like there's necessarily a ton of crazy technological advances in a lot of areas. But
I know that Margaret Atwood specifically only included things that she could find in human history.
Yeah,
everything that's in there is something that really happened somewhere.
Yes, I mean, it's very much like and I know I haven't read it because those books are really, really long. But my wife watched all of Handmaid's Tale. And so like I would see it every once in a while and someone's usually getting assaulted. But it's very much like this is Earth after some kind of like war happened. And then it's very much a dystopian sci-fi where there's like the outside world, but then there's this like society that exists that you follow. And then of course you have stuff like, I keep going back to Empire Silence, but that's like,
it's really good.
It is, but it's like, that's a fantasy story in a sci-fi setting. And a lot
like Red Rising is as well.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny.
But they're not the same thing.
Very different.
Both, when we talk about something like Stormlight Archive say often, I feel like it almost is sci-fi. I mean, it's such a well-realized, essentially other planet, even though it's not supposed to be in our own like solar system. But
they have pancakes.
I mean, just talking about the flora and the fauna and things like that, and the weather patterns and stuff. And so I feel like that's a good one that it's fantasy, but there are sci-fi elements to it, which is why I think sometimes in the heavy descriptions of the magic, it starts to feel like science. But to play off of what you said about we're so familiar with fantasy books, I mean, you could probably name off popular fantasy books that I haven't read and I could tell you what they're about. But A Memory Called Empire, I have heard Jesse talk about, I've heard Mara talk about, I've heard so many people talk about that book, and I'm like, language? I don't about. I couldn't tell you. I think there's language and there's a lady trying to like figure out a murder mystery in this new area. Like that's it. That's all I know.
Yeah.
Is it?
I think what's a good thing about sci-fi too, and this is probably less so for the fantasy blended ones where there's a lot of like story focus. A lot of sci-fi, you could basically spoil the entire book or talk about like exactly what the book is and not actually spoil it. Whereas like a fantasy book, if I told you exactly what happens with the main character and the story, you'd be like, well, thanks. Like you just ruined the book. But a lot of sci-fi, like I could sit there and explain to you like what 1984 is about and like things that happen in it. And you can still go and enjoy 1984, like having that information. It's not like it ruins the experience for you. And that happens a lot with sci-fi versus what I would think in fantasy. If I was like, well, this is what happens at the end of Ruin, you'd be like, no, don't say that. Like, stop it. But
it's totally ruin the whole experience. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think what you were saying too about like when the magic almost becomes scientific, that reminds me of Angela's videos that she makes, the science behind the magic, where she explains that like the physics or whatever, that like it could make sense, like, or this like magic system seems to be based on this. Or it straight up was by the author or whatever. I think she said Sanderson talked about that with
she was the one that made me understand what it is that people are getting out of this that I don't. I understand that that's happening and it's not for me, but I finally understand what it is that people are getting out of this.
You know what it is? I have to add too, Leanna, that I feel like sometimes as a video game fan, I'm like, could I play this magic system? That I know that sounds stupid, but if I can visualize it in a video game format, I think that tells, like, there's some magic systems that I'm like, I don't know how this works, and that can frustrate me. But if it's like, because Mistborn and the Final Empire basically is a video game tutorial for how allomancy works. And then I'm like, I got it. And that's why I'm always saying and make a great video game. Whereas Stormlight, I'm like, I don't got it. I don't have it necessarily if you asked me to break it down.
That's because soft magic systems sometimes just like anything could happen. And then that's when you run into some like plot conveniences or a Deus Ex Machina when something wasn't explained yet. But then it's like, oh yeah, by the way, it also does this. And like,
I almost feel like Stormlight's magic is a hard magic system that one, all the characters are discovering, and two, it's huge. When you have to look at all the different kinds of magic users in Stormlight, you're like, because I remember the personality test thing where Alan's like, I don't know what any of these
so many things.
There's so many. Alan's like, I don't know what all these are, Elle. I haven't, because Sean and I took the test like for each other. Yeah. And Alan did that with Christina. And then I was like, Alan, I don't know what they all are. And I've read the books. So I know Windrunner, I know those ones.
Edge Dancer.
Edge Dancer.
That's the name of a book.
It is.
Recognize that.
But just, there is we haven't really talked about it much, and I don't know if that there's much to say, but there is that little nugget of science fantasy in the center that is so, I feel like even though it's in theory kind of both, I feel like because it's both, it's so different from either. Because I feel like when you read something like The Book of the New Sun or The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, those would be, I would definitely say, are science fantasy. And for that reason, I feel like they're so different from any science fiction or fantasy. They're just like over there being all speculative. And I'm like, whoa.
That's why I think, I don't know if you know, I know you like the Wolf Leanna. I don't know if you know, I like Ninth Reign, the Winnowing Flame trilogy.
I own that.
Isn't that a fantasy book?
It is fantasy. I swear there are a lot of sci-fi elements in it as well. It's so like if anybody ever reads it, they'll know what I'm talking about.
I own it. Somebody sent it to me.
I own it too. I'm going.
I own it too.
What an angel!
Honestly, like now that you've said that, I mean, arguably the wolf could be science fiction because there isn't any magic in it. It's just like the scientific question: what if other humanoid species survived, not just Homo sapiens? Like that is a science question. That's not fantasy.
For sure. Who wrote Ninth Reign?
Jen Williams.
All right, it's down there somewhere. Oh, there it is. It's down there in the corner by Tad Williams. Haha. Hi, Cora.
There it is.
Yes, it's so
Thanks,
beautiful.
Leanna.
I have it too. I'm going to read it. I feel like I'll really like it.
I hope you guys like it. Anyway, I mean, it's definitely fantasy, but every time I go to describe it, I was talking to Sean about it, and I in fact, I was talking to Jesse about it earlier, and I was like, it's like having a fever dream. I mean, trying to describe it, like, and then there are these people, they're like kind of like elves, but these people are kind of like aliens, and you're like trying to describe everything, and a doggy, yay!
Hi, Cora. I don't know what happened to my lighting. I look like I'm red now. I don't know what's going on.
Are you an alien?
Yes.
Oh, doggy.
Aww.
Let's distract everybody from the conversation. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I don't know how much else I personally have to add.
No, I mean,
I feel like it all just for me boils down to what you said, Elle. Like when you're familiar, when you feel like or are like more of a veteran of a genre, like you know what to pay attention to and what you don't necessarily need to pay attention to. And I think that's what it boils down to me for why sci-fi, like sometimes I'm like, I don't, because I don't know what I'm supposed to
I don't know if any of us would be able to answer that question, but like what made us veterans of fantasy rather than veterans of sci-fi? Because you had to start as a noob at some point, and why did we start on the fantasy journey and not on
I mean, maybe it's rooted in the books for kids, like what we started as.
Right off the bat, I would say age. A lot of something. I would argue. I mean, shit. Everything that I own, probably sci-fi, except for like Hunger Games, is probably very heavily weighted towards adults. Especially when you get into more like thought-provoking sci-fi. Most kids aren't going to be reading like classic sci-fi because it's too dry. It's too detailed and it's too focused on the themes. And a lot of kids will need like an adventure. You need characters to follow. You need stuff to happen. Like
I'll add to. I know. Alan talks about this all the time, working at a high school, and how he feels like high schools drive students away from reading because they focus on books kids don't really want to read. And
really boring nonfiction.
Well, I was going to say some of the things you end up reading in school are like you're at 1984 or Fahrenheit 451, those kinds of books. And then fantasy becomes a thing you read for fun.
For escape.
And then so like it's like creates this idea in your mind that is something more intellectual and to be discussed in a classroom setting or with smart people, somebody who can guide you. It doesn't feel like something you can access easily yourself, even if that's not true. I think it's kind of something we tell ourselves. But I also think, to go off of Shoshana, what you were saying, it's not even just for me about knowing what to pay attention to, but reading enough of it to know what I do and don't like and being able to pinpoint that. Like I have to take more of a chance when I go for sci-fi, like, well, maybe I'll like this. Whereas fantasy, I know pretty quickly, like, I don't think that one's going to be for me.
Yeah, I actually, to that point about what made us veterans of the genre, if the people watching know any amazing childhood, like middle grade or even younger than that series that are sci-fi, I'd be curious. The only one I can think of is maybe Animorphs, and I think that that's not really even sci-fi because it's humans turning into animals.
Stuff that isn't. I mean, I guess there's also, we talked about the Marvel stuff. I mean, that's a decent segue in.
Yeah, and
they're comics though, so it's definitely a totally different avenue.
So I'm trying to think, like, because everything I'm thinking of is fantasy that I read as a kid.
I never even really read that much fantasy when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I read just like little chapter books, like contemporary little chapter books. There was no like big fantasy series I read as a kid.
Yeah,
interesting. Two things for me. So like Elle's part about like what should be like discussed in a classroom setting. I feel like when it comes to fantasy though, you can do that depending on what fantasy it is. So like no one's gonna have a class about like Fate of the Fallen by Kelcade. It's just kind of like a dumb, silly fantasy book that's over pretty quickly. Or like, but I mean, yeah, I read it like a year and a half ago. I don't remember if it was whatever. It was fine.
It was fine.
But something like A Song of Ice and Fire, or I guess smarter fantasy, or things that like really focus heavily on like how terrible people can be to each other. Like you can get a lot of discussion out of that.
Or reading Lord of the Rings as a classic.
Yeah, like you could talk about like how it mirrors real life, and that's why sci-fi kind of lends itself to that more so. But it's also why like if somebody's trying to get into sci-fi and all they read is fantasy, that's why that middle exists of sci-fantasy. Like recommend something like Red Rising or Empire of Silence to sort of like don't go straight to like the most hard sci-fi thing ever, because they might just be like, the hell is this? Why am I reading a science paper?
Even in college, like, because I went to school for writing and I had so many English classes and like English lit classes, and we read a lot of obviously like literary, like, and like contemporary nonfiction and whatever. But any like literature we read was either a classic or sci-fi. Never were we like discussing but like I agree, you totally can. Yeah. People just don't for whatever. I think it's just part of like the misconception, I think, of fantasy.
I mean, we kind of touched on this, but like rightly or wrongly, I find myself thinking that I'm not smart enough for science fiction. Where I'm
it happens a lot.
And yeah, and I know that, I mean, it's partly that like it's not a matter of being smart, but it's a matter of being like what things you are aware of, like somebody who's like really deep into hard sciences doesn't necessarily know anything about European history. Yeah. So like when George R. R. Martin is referencing the multiple wars that have happened. It's just
ignorance. I mean, you're just ignorant to what they're pulling from. That's all it is.
Yeah. And that's definitely not my wheelhouse. So like the kind of sci-fi that is more just like about humans and human culture, I'm like, well, that's my area.
Humans. I'm a human.
I mean, anthropology is literally, anthro means man, ology is study of. That's just, I'm an expert on humans.
No, I think that's definitely a big part of it. And perhaps the impression or misconception is like you have to be of a certain intelligence level. And I don't know too many people that think like I have to be of a certain intelligence level to read fantasy. I think with fantasy, it's more of like, oh my gosh, sorry, my dog. I think with fantasy, it's more of like, I just don't have that creativity, right? Like people are like, I just can't imagine those things. And then you're like, but you can. You just
unless it's Malazan, where you have to have a PhD.
Stop it.
Right, guys?
You don't. There's an Assassin's Guild, and there's like gods and convenient magic. It's like, anyway, I'm going to stop before I upset Malice stands.
It's funny. My husband also jokes that he's like not smart enough for fantasy.
Thank God.
Kidding, but like, isn't that funny that like we talk about the plebeians only read fantasy? Well, like I think that there is a misconception or an impression out there by some people that like fantasy is like more advanced because of everything we'd already talked about, like having to totally realize.
I mean, how creative do you have to be to create an entire world?
Yeah. I know, like my mom is always complaining about the fact that, and I don't know why she complains, because she doesn't read books at all, but she complains like because of empathy that like fantasy is always like long and in series. And she's like, why is nothing ever a standalone? I'm like, why do you care? You literally don't read any of it. It's because like you invented a world. So first you had to go and explain it. So first book, 1,000 pages, because not only did I tell a story, but I had to tell you about where it's happening. And then I've built this world. So I'm going to get everything I can out of it since I bothered to build this world. So we're going to tell 10 stories in this world.
And that's a big thing, Sean. He's like, ugh, it's all series. They're all so long. And I mean, this is somebody who grew up reading all the time. Yeah. And but now he's like exhausted, but he's reading this massive history book right now. just because that's what he's in the mood for. And I'm just like, And I sometimes I'll ask him, I'm like, do you ever think like, oh, my wife is reading such stupid books, all these make-believe books? And he's like, no, why would I think that? I'm like, I don't know. But that's what I think that everybody seems to have this. I shouldn't say everybody. Some people think they are intellectual for reading like fancy pants books, but a lot of people who are more humble or constantly putting themselves down think like, oh, I'm just reading like stupid people books. And then everybody seems to think like this other thing is actually
grass is always greener. I remember one of my best friends in college, because she was a toxicology major. So like she would be studying because she was my roommate, and I would be studying. And I would like the way you study for a toxicology exam is very different from you study for an anthropology exam. And like I always
out the window. Sorry.
Oh, but I always feel like dumb because she was like learning all these science facts, and the first time that I felt like on equal footing with her, when she was saying how she doesn't know, like for the first time in like for a long time, she actually has to write a paper, and she's like, I don't know how to write a paper. Like I don't know how to do that because I never have to write papers. So I'm like, writing a paper? I do that all the time. That's easy. So like it just like it never occurred to me that she might view what I do as difficult.
Right, and that's something I try. Because words matter, and I find that as a society collectively, we tend to attribute the word intelligence to people that specialize in certain fields.
STEM.
Whereas we tend to call people who specialize in other fields talented, or just basically like, wow, you're so talented, or like you're a prodigy or something like that, as if it's this easy thing that didn't also. But intelligence is the application of knowledge into like these skills. And so, I use the example of someone like my dad who built like 2 rooms onto the back of the house and a whole patio and everything. This is somebody who just by living in poverty only ever got to go through middle school. He didn't have any YouTube videos. He built all this all by himself. Like he had no knowledge. And we're like, how did he do that? Like that to me is
practice
level.
Yeah.
But like this is a guy who would say wash instead of wash. So there would be people that
he's not like, book smart. It's just a different.
It's like intelligence and ignorance are two like knowing things versus.
And it's funny.
Capacity to know things.
In high school or just school in general, everybody thought I was going to go into like a math or science field because I always did really well with those things in school. But then I majored in music. And then I saw the way all of a sudden, like nobody ever considered me smart. It was like, wow, you're so talented. And I'm like, I mean, have you tried playing some of these pieces? Have you watched like Joshua Bell play the Tchaikovsky violin concerto? You're telling me memorizing all that, the rhythm that it takes, the quickness to be able to process something and then do it here, and the muscle, like all of it is.
However, I bet they would all think that the person who wrote those symphonies is a genius.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think all the time, like, I don't know how Tchaikovsky did this, or I don't know how did Bach know, like, and it's just, you're constantly, it's the next thing, right? Like what you're doing is never. But then it's funny when you meet people who do feel really smart about themselves, and then we're like, wow, there's no so like there's no winning. Either none of us.
There's a really funny comedy sketch about this like cocktail party where someone is a rocket scientist, and like there's a brain surgeon. He keeps telling everybody like, asking, oh, what do you do for a living? And he's like, oh, well, I'm a brain surgeon, so it is actually brain surgery. And then like he keeps doing that the whole party, and then finally someone else comes in and like, what do you do? He's like, I'm a scientist. I mainly deal in rockets. Like, yeah, so it is actually rocket science.
Have you seen Mark Lawrence's bio?
Not recently.
Yeah,
I like his books though.
Let me see if I can find it, because I always get a good chuckle out of. I like how detailed we have gotten.
While she looks for that, I mainly read books for an escape anyway, for the same reason that I play video games. So if somebody's shitting on my intelligence, sorry for the swear. It's like, oops. I'm swearing and Jashawn is not. I have no self-control. I read books to have fun and escape from reality because that's interesting. Yeah. So it's like, even if it's a hard sci-fi, like it's still interesting. And that's why I'm not reading it to be like high-minded or smarter than other people. It's like, I'm not reading the Wheel of Time to be like, oh, I read the Wheel of Time. How about
You
you?
are smarter than everyone else, so
Exactly.
you don't need to prove it.
Alex is the Chandler of our friend group who has the job nobody can.
Yeah, no idea.
That's true.
I found the thing from Mark Lawrence. It says his day job is as a research scientist focused on various rather intractable problems in the field of artificial intelligence. He has held secret level clearance with both US and UK governments. At one point, he was qualified to say, "This isn't rocket science." Oh, wait, it actually is.
Well, actually,
Wow. Because I'm like, I think you wrote that about yourself, right? Like, or someone else.
that's great. And this is Mark Lawrence, the author.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So he's literally a rocket scientist, or was at some point.
I liked his Book of the Ancestor. That has nothing to do with rocket science, though.
Yeah.
What, you don't like it?
I liked it.
Leanna just hates all books.
I'm the worst. It is known.
Anyway, I feel like all of us giggly folk are not too stupid for sci-fi. If we wanted to give it a try, I think we would be fine. But anyway.
That's what you think because you're a big dum-dum that doesn't know science.
Yeah. I gotta go back to school to read these big, intelligent people books.
I mean, just briefly, if you just look at how they're marketed, though, the covers of fantasy books are Technicolor and rainbows, and science books not science books, science fiction books tend to be they look drier and smarter.
Minimal.
Plain,
Yeah.
I'm a serious book. I'm not like a fantasy covered in Lisa Frank colors.
Except for Leviathan Wake's 10th anniversary. Fuchsia.
I feel like even just having the word science in the name, science fiction, when, as we've discussed, some of it's not necessarily even science and per se. So anyway, I think we got a little off topic there toward the end, but it wouldn't be a Worldhoppers video if we didn't.
Yeah.
So anybody have any last thoughts that they'd like to contribute?
Everyone should read what they want to read.
That's a thought.
Special and smart in their own way.
I just think that science fiction and fantasy are both telling you something that isn't actually possible and are saying, what if it was? It's just fantasy has the integrity to admit that they're not saying that this is possible.
Yes.
Oh man,
Fantasy has no integrity. Moral of this video.
So that's where you need to cut the video and just
Wait.
and zoom in on Leanna's face.
Misconceptions.
Yeah, there we go. Oh my God.
Well, thanks everybody for joining. Everybody who watches this, I hope the science fiction fans are not hurt by this video. You might be.
We'll try to read more.
Give us all your recommendations.
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.